December 10th, 1942. The cold, unforgiving depths of the Pacific Ocean whispered as the USS Nautilus sliced through the water, its nuclear-powered engines purring like a beast beneath the surface. The world above was oblivious to the silent battle being waged in the darkness of the ocean, but deep within the heart of this mighty vessel, Commander Richard O'Neill stood at the helm, his face illuminated only by the dim glow of the radar screens. For O'Neill, the ocean was more than just a battlefield. It was a personal battleground. His entire life had been a preparation for this moment. A graduate of the United States Naval Academy, O'Neill was not just a commander. He was a product of years of training, discipline, and strategic thinking. The Nautilus, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine, was an extension of his own will, a perfect blend of human ingenuity and raw power. But today it was not just about proving the Nautilus' power, it was about survival. Their mission was one of stealth, precision, and absolute secrecy. The year was 1942, the height of World War II, and the Pacific Ocean was the stage for an ever-intensifying game of cat and mouse between the United States and Japan. Both powers had risen from the ashes of the Second World War, each determined to prove their superiority. The stakes were high, and the methods had changed. Warfare was no longer fought just on the surface or in the skies, but beneath the waves in the unseen, uncharted waters of the deep. O'Neill was no stranger to the weight of command, but this mission carried more gravity than any other he had led. He could feel it in his bones, this growing sense of tension that had been building ever since the Nautilus had submerged. The crew, a blend of seasoned sailors and fresh faces, were all too aware of the importance of their task: to remain unseen, to strike without warning, and to disappear into the depths before anyone could even realize they were there. But this was not just another covert operation. The Nautilus was different. Its very existence was a secret weapon, an unseen threat capable of shifting the balance of power beneath the oceans. It was a machine built for the impossible, the ability to remain submerged for weeks, to move silently through the vastness of the Pacific, and to strike where the enemy least expected it. It was not just a weapon of war, it was a weapon of psychological warfare. If they could remain unseen, they could change the entire course of the conflict. If they were detected, well, the consequences were too dire to even consider. The USS Nautilus had already been at sea for 2 weeks, patrolling the waters in complete silence. O'Neill had been briefed on the mission before they left port, but as the days wore on and the tension built, the stakes began to feel all too real. Their target was a Japanese convoy, heavily guarded and well-armed, traveling along a well-established route. Their task was clear: approach silently, launch their strike, and then vanish, leaving no trace behind. O'Neill's eyes were fixed on the sonar, his mind sharp with focus. The quiet hum of the reactor was the only sound in the control room, and for a moment it was as if the world above and below had faded away. He could feel the weight of the ocean pressing against the hull, a constant reminder of the deep chasm in which they now operated. But it was the silence of the submarine that unsettled him the most, the eerie quiet that surrounded them, making every movement feel amplified, every sound more intense than it should have been. The crew worked in unison, the rhythm of their movements honed over months of training. The sonar officer, a young man with wide eyes and a tense jaw, looked over at O'Neill, his voice low and urgent. "Commander, the convoy's approaching. We're in position." O'Neill nodded, his gaze never leaving the radar screen. The convoy was within reach. The moment of truth had arrived. "Prepare to engage," O'Neill ordered, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of anxiety. "Silent running. All systems off except for essential operations." The Nautilus responded immediately. The once thrumming engine quieted to a near-silent hum, and the crew fell into an almost unnatural stillness. They were ready, but O'Neill could feel the nerves of the men around him. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the signal to strike. It was a moment of sheer focus, where every decision would determine the outcome of the mission. And with each passing second, the tension in the control room seemed to grow tighter, more suffocating. "Distance to convoy?" O'Neill asked, his voice breaking the silence like a whip crack. 2 miles, Commander," came the sonar officer's response. O'Neill took a slow breath, his fingers drumming nervously against the edge of his console. The convoy was closer now, but they had to remain undetected. Their technology, the cutting-edge radar evading systems, the stealthy hull, the nuclear propulsion, was the only thing that stood between them and failure. The Japanese had no idea they were coming, but in this moment, as the ocean pressed in from all sides, O'Neill could not shake the feeling that they were already being watched. He had trained his entire life for this mission, but now with the pressure mounting and the stakes higher than ever, even he wasn't sure what would come next. The seconds stretched into eternity as the Nautilus crept closer to the convoy, its crew waiting for the green light to unleash their strike. O'Neill's mind was sharp, every calculation running in his head. If they failed, it wouldn't just be the loss of a mission. It would be the loss of everything they had worked for. And then, as the seconds ticked away, the silence was broken by a small, almost imperceptible sound. A faint ping from the sonar. "Commander," the sonar officer's voice shook. "We're not alone." A chill ran through O'Neill. His heart skipped a beat. "Sonar, what's the range?" O'Neill demanded, his voice steely, though his pulse raced. The officer hesitated, eyes glued to the sonar screen. "Unknown. It's coming from above us, and it's closing in fast." The air in the control room grew thick with anxiety. They were not alone in these depths. Something was tracking them, something unseen and deadly. O'Neill's mind raced. If they were detected now, the entire mission, everything they had worked for, could be lost in an instant. The Nautilus had been designed to evade detection, but what if their luck had finally run out? "Brace yourselves," O'Neill ordered, his voice low, the tension almost unbearable. "We're not going to make it easy for them." And with that, the crew of the USS Nautilus prepared for the fight of their lives. The tension in the control room was palpable. A quiet hum filled the space as the crew of the USS Nautilus braced for the unknown. O'Neill stood at the helm, his mind racing with calculations and contingencies. He had led countless missions, each one with its own dangers. But this was different. The stakes had never been higher, and the pressure to succeed, to remain undetected, was suffocating. The faint sonar ping that had shattered the silence was a warning, but to O'Neill it felt like an omen. Something was out there, lurking in the deep. It could be a Japanese submarine, or worse, a reconnaissance ship equipped with the latest technology, designed to track them. Either way, it was a threat, one that could compromise everything. "Sonar, what's the distance?" O'Neill demanded, his voice steely, though there was a nervous edge he couldn't shake. The sonar officer, Lieutenant Markson, a young but highly skilled sailor, was staring intently at his screen. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his knuckles white from gripping the sonar controls. "It's hard to tell, sir," Markson replied, his voice strained. "The signal's faint, but it's moving. It's coming from above us, and it's closing in fast. I'd say 50 yards, maybe less." O'Neill's heart skipped a beat. 50 yards? That was nothing. The enemy could already be within range to launch a torpedo, and if they were detected now, the mission would fail. Worse, they'd be sitting ducks. "We need to get out of here," O'Neill muttered almost to himself, "but we can't risk making a sound." As the seconds stretched, the weight of the decision bore down on O'Neill. The Nautilus was a marvel of military engineering, but it wasn't invincible. It relied on the element of surprise, on staying hidden. If the enemy knew where they were, they would be in danger, but O'Neill knew that abandoning the mission and fleeing would be a failure that would haunt him, his crew, and the entire Navy. "Commander," said Lieutenant Collins, the executive officer, breaking O'Neill's thoughts. He was a veteran, calm and collected, but even he couldn't hide the unease in his eyes. "What if we move up? We could change our course, make a break for it. We still have time to get away." O'Neill looked at him, and for a moment there was silence. Collins had a point. A tactical retreat could save them, but at what cost? The Japanese convoy was within reach, closer than they had ever been. They had been tracking it for days, and this was their moment to strike. Collins continued, his voice lower now, his eyes never leaving O'Neill's. "We're here to complete the mission. If we fail now, we've lost everything. The Navy will never trust us again." O'Neill felt the weight of Collins' words. They had worked so hard to get here, to remain unseen, to stay hidden in the depths. This was the moment, the one where their success could change the course of the Pacific War. But it was also the moment where everything could unravel. He knew that a retreat might be the smarter choice, but could he live with the consequences of abandoning their mission? The silence in the room deepened, each crew member feeling the gravity of the decision. No one spoke. There was no need. The tension was too thick to be broken by words. Suddenly, the quiet was shattered once more, this time by the voice of Petty Officer Graves, the radar technician. "Commander, we've got another signal," Graves said, his voice tight. "It's bigger, much bigger. It's coming in fast." O'Neill's pulse quickened. "What do you mean, bigger?" Graves hesitated, eyes wide. "Sir, it's a ship. I think it's a surface vessel, possibly a Japanese destroyer. It's fast and it's directly above us. They must have tracked us." The realization hit O'Neill like a punch to the gut. They were surrounded. If the destroyer had detected them, the mission was over. There would be no escape, no second chance. They were sitting ducks, and the Japanese would likely launch their attack any second. "We can't outrun them. They've already got our position," Collins said, his voice full of quiet desperation. "It's over, O'Neill. We need to abort." But O'Neill wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The Nautilus was built for moments like this, silent, fast, and deadly. But it was only a tool. The crew were the ones who made it lethal. "No," O'Neill said, his voice colder now. "We're not aborting. We've come this far. We finished the mission." The crew exchanged uncertain glances, but there was no question now. O'Neill's word was law. The mission would continue. The Nautilus would remain silent and move deeper into the abyss, hoping beyond hope that they could avoid detection. "Prepare to dive deeper," O'Neill ordered, his voice unwavering. "We need to stay below their radar. Get us to 1,500 feet. Now." As the submarine descended deeper into the ocean, the crew held their breath. Each man in the control room could feel the weight of the decision settling over them. Their future, their survival depended on a razor-thin margin. If they could get low enough, stay hidden just long enough, they could survive this, just. O'Neill's mind raced. The thought of failure gnawed at him, but there was no time for doubt. The Japanese convoy was still their target, and every instinct told him that if they could get one more chance, one more strike, they could change the tide of the war. The Nautilus was the spearhead of that change, but it had to remain hidden. It had to remain undetected. Suddenly, the sonar officer's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Commander, the surface vessel is almost directly above us. It's slowing down." "Why?" O'Neill asked, his heart thudding in his chest. "I don't know, sir," the sonar officer replied, "but it stopped moving. They're not searching anymore." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. What did that mean? Had they been detected? Had the Japanese realized the Nautilus was there and were waiting for the right moment to strike? "I'm not taking any chances," O'Neill said, his voice steady even as his mind raced. "We stay silent and we keep our course. We're not leaving without a strike." But the fear was palpable now. It was a fear that had settled deep within the crew, a fear that this was the beginning of the end. No one could shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something they couldn't control. The ocean outside, once a vast expanse of safety, now felt like a prison. And then it came, the faintest ping. "Sir," Markson's voice cracked, "they've detected us. They're closing in fast." O'Neill's eyes widened. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The Nautilus was no longer a predator in the shadows. It was a hunted animal. The tension inside the Nautilus was unbearable. Every second stretched into eternity. The sonar officer, Markson, his face pale with fear, stared at the sonar screen. The blip that had once been faint now pulsed steadily, growing stronger, closer, a direct indication that the Japanese vessel above them was no longer just searching, but locking onto their position. "Sir, they're coming for us. They've triangulated our location," Markson's voice trembled. O'Neill's grip tightened around the command console. He could hear the dull thrum of the reactor in the background, a constant hum that now felt like a countdown to disaster. They had been compromised. "Raise depth to 1,800 feet, O'Neill ordered, his voice steady despite the raging storm in his mind. They had to get deeper, farther out of reach, even if that meant risking the strain on the hull and reactor. But as the submarine descended into the darker depths, there was a sinking feeling in O'Neill's gut. The surface vessel was not the only threat. The convoy was still there, somewhere ahead, unaware of their position. At least that's what they hoped. But with the Japanese destroyer closing in, there was no time for second guesses. "Commander," Collins spoke up, his face drawn and weary, "we can't keep running. They've already detected us. We'll never reach the convoy before they've finished their sweep." O'Neill turned to face his executive officer, his expression grim. Collins had a point. Every second they spent running further into the depths made the mission riskier, and the longer they waited, the more likely it became that they would be discovered by another surface ship or an additional Japanese sub. "I'm aware of that, Collins," O'Neill said, his voice taut, "but we're not running forever. We're still in this." Collins' eyes narrowed, his mouth set in a hard line. "Then we fight." A heavy silence fell between them. O'Neill's gaze moved across the control room, meeting the eyes of his crew. Every one of them understood the gravity of their position. The Nautilus was meant to be a ghost, unseen, undetected, capable of striking without warning. But now they were anything but invisible. They were a target. The enemy knew their position. The only question was, what would the Japanese destroyer do next? "Can we fight?" O'Neill asked, almost to himself. His mind was a whirlwind of choices. The Nautilus was equipped with torpedoes, highly advanced, capable of devastating anything in their path. But if they used them now, the entire ocean would know their location. They would have no way of escaping. They would be a sitting target for the Japanese destroyer above and whatever other ships were lurking nearby. The thought of abandoning the mission, the reason they had risked everything to begin with, gnawed at him. Their primary objective was the convoy. They had to reach it, strike, and disappear. But if they fought here, now, they could lose it all. The crew was waiting. They could feel the tension, the weight of the choice O'Neill had to make. If he said fight, the mission would change from an invisible strike to a battle for survival. But if he said run, they would retreat, leaving the convoy to continue its journey, knowing the mission was a failure. The lives of everyone aboard the Nautilus depended on this decision. "Sir," Markson's voice broke the silence, "they're closing in. The destroyer is within range. We can't avoid it anymore." O'Neill's heart raced as he turned to face the sonar screen. The Japanese vessel was nearly on top of them. It was too late to escape. It was too late to hide. The time for running had passed. "Do we have enough time to launch?" O'Neill asked, looking at Collins. "We have one shot," Collins replied, his eyes hard. "If we're going to survive, we need to hit them first." O'Neill's mind raced. One shot, one chance to strike before they were overwhelmed. His eyes shifted to the radar, the pitch-black ocean outside, and then to the faces of his crew. This wasn't just about completing the mission anymore. This was about survival. He turned to Lieutenant Thompson, the weapons officer. "Prepare the torpedo bays." Thompson nodded, though there was hesitation in his eyes. "Aye, Commander." The minutes passed like hours. O'Neill watched as the destroyer's sonar signature loomed ever closer. They were running out of time. His fingers hovered over the console, ready to give the command to launch the torpedoes. But something held him back. Something in the pit of his stomach told him that they were about to make a decision that would change everything. It was a choice he couldn't undo. He looked back at Collins, whose eyes met his with a look of grim resolve. "This is it," O'Neill said, his voice steady. "We fight." The words hung in the air like a sentence. There was no turning back now. The Nautilus would fight, one last shot at survival, one last chance to complete the mission. O'Neill's hand slammed down on the console. The decision made. "Launch torpedoes," O'Neill commanded. The silence was shattered by the deafening sound of the torpedo tubes releasing. The crew's collective breath caught in their throats as the Nautilus trembled, the tension in the air thickening. "Target locked," Thompson reported. "Torpedoes away." The seconds felt like years. The crew watched the sonar screen, every eye trained on the incoming targets. The Japanese destroyer was still within range, but now it was locked in the Nautilus's sights. The torpedoes would hit first, and then a sudden deafening explosion rocked the submarine. The Nautilus shuddered violently, throwing O'Neill off balance. The walls seemed to close in around them as the entire vessel groaned under the force of the shockwave. "We've hit them!" Thompson shouted, his voice shaking with excitement and fear. "But we've been detected." The control room erupted into chaos. Alarms blared as the sonar officer scrambled to pinpoint the new enemy position. O'Neill stood frozen, his mind racing. The torpedo had hit, but now they were exposed. They were no longer a shadow in the depths. The Japanese knew they were there, and the real battle had just begun. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers," O'Neill shouted, his voice cutting through the panic. "Get us out of here. We're not done yet." But as the Nautilus shifted into action, O'Neill's mind lingered on the decision he had just made. Was it the right one? Was there a way out, or had he condemned them all? The air was thick with the tension of the unknown. The fight was on, and the Nautilus was not just facing the Japanese destroyer now. It was facing the unknown consequences of their actions and the brutal reality of war. The question now was not if they would survive, but how long they could hold on. And deep below, in the darkness of the ocean, the real battle for their lives had only just begun. The Nautilus lurched forward, its hull creaking under the strain as the first shock wave from the explosion rattled the vessel. The enemy destroyer had been hit, but the victory felt hollow. The crew, still shaken from the blast, scrambled to maintain control. The high-pitched wail of the alarm mixed with the rumbling sound of the reactor struggling to maintain its power as they prepared for the next strike. O'Neill stood at the helm, his mind spinning with calculations, the weight of responsibility heavier than ever. He knew what was at stake. The Japanese had now detected them, and the battle had shifted from stealth to survival. The Nautilus was a ghost no longer. It was a hunted beast, and its fate lay in their hands. "Damage report," O'Neill barked, his voice low but urgent. Thompson, the weapons officer, was the first to respond, his face pale as he looked over his instruments. "Hull integrity is holding, sir, but we've got some internal damage. Nothing catastrophic yet. We've lost power to one of the torpedo bays, but we're still operational." Collins, standing beside O'Neill, kept his eyes on the sonar. The Japanese destroyer was closing in, its presence unmistakable, and the faint sonar ping of an approaching submarine added another layer of tension. The odds were stacked against them now. They had fired their shot, but that wasn't enough. They were vulnerable, sitting at the mercy of the enemy's next move. "We need to get out of here, now," Collins said, his voice tight. O'Neill's mind raced. They could make a break for it, but they had to go deeper, out of range, out of sight. But the Nautilus had already endured one battle, and now it was weaker, slower, and under even more scrutiny. The enemy was fast and determined, and O'Neill wasn't sure how much longer they could hold on. They were running out of options. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers," O'Neill said, his hands slamming down on the controls. "Get us to 2,000 feet. We need to outrun them." The crew moved quickly, their actions synchronized, each man well aware of the gravity of their task. The Nautilus surged deeper into the abyss, the sound of the submarine's hull groaning in protest, but the noise was swallowed by the ocean, just as it had been designed to do. O'Neill had made his choice. Escape was their only option. They had to disappear again, like shadows in the dark. But as the depth increased, so did the pressure on their fragile bodies. The deeper they went, the more vulnerable they became. "Sir," Markson, the sonar officer, called out, his voice filled with disbelief. "The enemy, they're not pulling back. They're tracking us. They're closing in fast." O'Neill felt his chest tighten. There was no escape. The Japanese were relentless. But there was something else in Markson's voice, a sense of urgency, something that suggested the crew wasn't alone in their growing panic. "Activate the decoys," O'Neill said quickly. "We need to confuse their sonar." It was a last-ditch effort to buy them more time, deploying sonar decoys that would scatter signals and give them a fleeting chance to break free. But the seconds felt like hours. The tension inside the Nautilus was suffocating, the weight of every decision building like an avalanche. As the decoys activated, the crew held their breath. The Nautilus was a technological marvel, but no technology could guarantee safety in a situation like this. And then, as if to drive the point home, a voice from the back of the room called out, "Incoming!" A torpedo streaked through the water, its path marked by a faint trail of bubbles that danced in the sonar's vision. The first explosion hit with a terrifying roar, and the entire submarine rocked violently. For a split second, O'Neill felt weightless. The walls of the control room bent inward. The pressure was too much force for the fragile metal to bear. "We've been hit! Damage report!" O'Neill shouted, his voice filled with disbelief. "Forward compartments breached. Hull integrity at 60%. "Graves," the radar technician shouted back. "We're taking on water." O'Neill's heart skipped a beat. They were losing the Nautilus. "Full reverse!" O'Neill screamed. "Get us out of here!" But the reverse thrusters struggled to engage. The submarine's power had already been compromised by the earlier blast, and now it was as if the ocean itself was pushing back against them. The water pressure, the weight of the ocean, the constant barrage of sonar sweeps. It was too much. "Sir, there's a pressure spike in the reactor," Thompson called, his voice barely audible above the din. "If we don't stabilize it—" The words hit O'Neill like a punch to the gut. The reactor was the heart of the Nautilus. Without it, they were dead in the water. Literally. And the pressure of the ocean was pushing them deeper, making the situation even more dire. O'Neill's mind raced, calculating every possible move. They were in a race against time. The Nautilus was sinking, and sinking fast. Their only hope now was to make it back to the surface before the reactor failed completely. But that meant abandoning the mission, the very thing they had fought for. He turned to Collins, his expression grim. "Collins, take over. Get us to the surface. Now." "Sir, you can't—" Collins began, but O'Neill interrupted him with a sharp shake of his head. "I'll stay. Get us out of here. That's an order." There was no time to argue. The decision had been made. O'Neill knew what was at stake. He couldn't sacrifice the lives of his crew for the mission. The Nautilus was sinking, and it was his responsibility to get them to safety. "Get to the surface, Collins. I'll handle the reactor." The gravity of O'Neill's words hit Collins hard, but he didn't hesitate. "Aye, sir." As Collins turned to execute the command, O'Neill moved swiftly toward the reactor control panel. His hands flew over the controls, his mind focused on one thing only: stabilizing the reactor before it went critical. The pressure was mounting, but he couldn't afford to let panic take hold. The reactor was their lifeline, and O'Neill knew that the only way to keep it from exploding was to sacrifice the Nautilus's final moments. He adjusted the stabilizers, tweaking the coolant system, but it was clear that the damage was too severe. He had only moments left. "Thompson, get those torpedo tubes online. We need to defend ourselves if they come for us," O'Neill ordered, but his focus remained fixed on the reactor. He could feel the heat rising from the core, the warning lights flashing red. The countdown had begun. The crew worked quickly, desperate, but O'Neill knew they were on borrowed time. He reached over, his hand hovering over the emergency shutdown switch for the reactor. The water around them was dark, almost suffocating. The Nautilus was drifting, caught in the current of its own sinking fate. The crew members, their faces drawn with exhaustion, could do nothing but wait as the submarine systems continued to fail. And then, as the lights flickered one final time, O'Neill made his decision. With one last breath, he slammed his hand down on the reactor's emergency shutdown. The moment O'Neill hit the shutdown button, a silence fell over the control room. It wasn't a calm silence. It was a deafening void that consumed everything. The frantic beeping of the alarms, the wail of the emergency lights flickering above. The reactor, their only hope for survival, was now still, its systems shut down in the final, desperate act of a commander who knew his time had run out. The Nautilus groaned, a low, almost mournful sound, as the pressure around them increased with every passing second. O'Neill's heart pounded in his chest as the oxygen levels began to drop. He didn't look at the crew. He couldn't. They were too close to the surface now, but the damage was done. The Nautilus was already a broken shell of what it had once been. The world would never know what had happened here, in the depths of the Pacific. It would all be buried with them, swallowed up by the ocean. His hand still gripped the shutdown switch, the physical symbol of his last act of leadership. He had made the decision to sacrifice the Nautilus for the survival of his crew. There had been no other choice. But now, with everything descending into chaos, he couldn't help but wonder, was it the right decision? Could he have fought harder to save the mission? Could they have turned the tide if he had trusted in the Nautilus a little longer? But these questions were irrelevant now. The Nautilus was beyond saving. He was beyond saving. The battle had been fought, and in that final act of selflessness, O'Neill had embraced the very essence of leadership, choosing the lives of his men over the success of the mission. He had no idea whether they would make it back to the surface, but he knew that in his final moments, he had done everything he could. The crew worked feverishly, their movements sharp and deliberate, pushing the Nautilus toward the surface. They could feel the ocean pushing back, the currents threatening to drag them deeper, but there was something in their movements, an unspoken bond, a trust that held them together. They fought as one, each man knowing what was at stake. They could feel the weight of O'Neill's decision in every pull, every turn of the wheel, and every breath they took. The submarine's engines sputtered, its propellers struggling against the weight of their descent. The atmosphere inside the hull had become thick with tension. Every moment felt stretched, as if they were caught in a bubble of time that refused to break. "Surface now!" O'Neill shouted, his voice hoarse. "We need to get to the surface. We need to make it back." The crew nodded, but no one spoke. They were too focused on the task at hand. The Nautilus was their lifeline, but the price for that lifeline had been steep. O'Neill had given everything for them to survive, and now it was their turn to prove that they could honor that sacrifice. But as the Nautilus began to rise, the impact of O'Neill's decision started to sink in. They had no way of knowing what awaited them on the surface. The Japanese destroyer was still out there somewhere. The convoy had already passed, and with it, the chance to complete their mission. The world would never know what they had achieved or failed to achieve. Their legacy would be lost to the deep. As the submarine broke through the surface, the sudden rush of air was almost a shock to their systems. The cool breeze felt like a cruel reminder of how far they had fallen, from the pinnacle of technological achievement to the shattered remains of a broken mission. The crew stood in silence, their faces pale and drawn, as the Nautilus drifted on the water's surface, a relic of war. O'Neill stood at the helm, his hands resting on the console, his eyes staring out at the horizon. The ocean was still, its surface reflecting the blue sky above, but within him, there was nothing but turmoil. He had made the right choice, but the consequences of that choice would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had led his crew to safety, but in doing so, he had failed the mission. The weight of that failure sat on his shoulders like an anchor. Collins approached O'Neill, his face solemn. He didn't need to say anything. His eyes said it all. They had survived. They had escaped, but the cost had been steep, and the mission, the purpose they had set out with, had been lost. For a moment, they both stood in silence, knowing that no words could ease the burden of what had transpired. Finally, O'Neill spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. "We did the right thing. We saved each other." Collins nodded slowly. "We did, sir." And with that, the reality of their survival began to settle in. They had made it. They had survived the impossible. But the truth, the bitter truth, was that they would never be the same. The Nautilus would never be the same. O'Neill's leadership had saved their lives, but it had come at the cost of their mission, and of a legacy that would never be told. As they sailed back to port, O'Neill looked out over the ocean, the vast expanse that had nearly consumed them. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the water, but the sight did little to ease the emptiness he felt inside. The ocean was a place of mystery, of power, and of secrets. It had swallowed up countless lives, countless stories, and it had swallowed theirs too. What remained now was a hollow victory, their survival, but at what cost? Inspired by a true letter from 1943, written by Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, in which he reflected on the loss of the USS Yorktown during the Battle of Midway. The sacrifice of the Yorktown's crew and the subsequent rescue of its survivors served as a stark reminder that in the heart of war, sometimes survival is the greatest victory and the heaviest burden.